What's good, Green Team? We are in part 4 of 6 in our series of navigating a contract to closing. Today, we are going to talk about understanding the financing process. Again, this series applies to whether you are the listing agent or the selling agent, how to get something that went under contract to the closing table, which is a big goal and has a big effect on our success as realtors. And today, we're already through the inspection period, agreed on TRRs, we're working through repairs, and now we have to understand what's going on in the financing process. There is a lot of separation between us as realtors and the financing process for good reason. However, we need to understand the steps that are going on behind the scenes so that we can communicate clearly with our buyer and seller and the other realtor during this process to make sure everyone's staying on the same track towards the goal of getting closed. So understanding the financing process is going to cover 5 parts. First, getting appraisals ordered. Second, working through underwriting. Third, receiving the clear to close. Then reading a closing disclosure and then reviewing the settlement statement. So first off, we got to get an appraisal ordered. Remember when we went through the contract, we saw there's a 5-day period from the time reference date that we have as the buyer to get an appraisal ordered and start the loan process. Well, your question might be, who orders the appraisal? Who's in charge of that? Is it the realtor? Well, the appraisal process is done by the buyer ordering the appraisal through the lender. So what happens is the loan officer will take the contract and contact the buyer and say, hey, we've got an order and appraisal within 5 days. Are you good with it? And then they will invoice them and the buyer will pay that up front. So that's an upfront cost that your buyer needs to know about. And those can range anywhere from $450 to $650 on appraisal price. So you want to make sure your buyer knows that that's going to be something they pay upfront, not it's a closing cost, but it's paid up front, not at closing. So the way it works is the appraiser says, okay, great, we've got the appraisal ordered. We're going to send out the message that we need an appraisal on this property at 4021 Sam Gordon Drive. And then they're going to put it into a big pool. Now, appraisers look into the pool and they say, okay, I want to do that appraisal. They grab it and say, I'm going to handle that. Now, associated with that appraisal is a form, and the form for the appraisal looks just like this. This is your uniform residential appraisal report. We don't usually see these unless an appraisal comes in low, and then we'll get to see it and we can maybe help us understand if a square footage was off or what comps were used. But this is what appraisers are using. They're filling out all the info about this property, and then they have to give comparable sales based off of county data uh, to this subject property to justify the price. What's happening is the bank is saying, okay, we're looking to loan this amount of money to the buyer to buy this house. However, if something goes wrong, we need to know that this house could be sold in order to get our money back. So they're using an independent party called an appraiser to verify that the property is worth that amount so that the lender feels comfortable lending the money, knowing that if all goes wrong, they could resell the property and get their money back out of the deal. That's the whole appraisal process. And because of that relationship where the bank has to trust the appraiser and the realtors are trusting an appraiser, we can't be super involved with the appraiser making their decision. It has to be an independent party making this decision. And sometimes that can be frustrating as realtors because we can't be more involved and understand more of the process. But we're a little bit in the dark in what's going on. So they're basically going to the property. They're going to fill out this form and give their report of the value of the property. What we need to happen is we need that value to be the sales price of the property so that the loan can go through. If it is lower than the sales price, then it's back to the negotiating table for the buyers and sellers to figure out what the price of the property is going to be, or if both sides want to dissolve the contract. So it gets very complicated when the appraisal comes in low, but we're going to hope that it meets value. The other piece is that appraiser is going to have a due back date. This is how you want to talk to lenders when you're talking about appraisals. You're going to ask them, hey, is there a due? Okay, it's great. It's been ordered. I understand. Do we have a due back date? Because this lets us know when that appraiser has been told to send that form back in. So we want to verify with the lender it's been ordered, verify there's a due back date. And then the next thing, if we're on the selling side, we can talk to the listing agent and say, hey, have you heard from the appraiser yet? Has he scheduled a time to come out and appraise the property? That lets us know that it's been scheduled. We've got a due back date. We know we're on track. Those are all the issues that we want to deal with in appraisals, but we don't actually handle the ordering of them or the coordinating of them other than letting the appraiser get in the property if we are the listing agent. Okay, so the next step of the financing process is it's got to be worked through underwriting. So who's the underwriter? The underwriter is someone that works for the bank that is in charge of evaluating the file to make sure the file is put together in a way that the bank can resell the loan or service the loan based off of all of the information that the buyer has given and proven the information to be accurate information. So what happens is the underwriter reviews the file, they send a list back to the loan officer and say, hey, here's all the stuff we're missing. Talk to the buyer, get this extra stuff for us. The loan officer goes to the buyer, says, hey, they need these extra items. The buyer sends it in. The underwriter reviews it. They may be still missing a couple items. So as this process goes back and forth, they kind of work through until the underwriter gives you this really great moment where they tell you we're clear to close. The key during the underwriting process is to keep updating the buyer and loan officer on what's going on your end so that hopefully they will update you on what's going on in this underwriting process. Because again, we're kind of held out of it, and it's a very important process that has to happen. And the underwriter eventually says, hopefully, we're clear to close, which is a great, great thing from the lender to get. Once we know we're clear to close, it basically means that the buyer has been officially approved for this loan. Financing should not hold us up, and we are good to set a date and get everything worked out, scheduling our closing. So this is a big moment for the buyer that they've kind of jumped over all the hurdles that the underwriter and the bank has set for them. And now we can move forward with our transaction knowing that this is a pretty solid piece of our transaction. This is a great time to take your email and send an email to our staff, whoever's our transaction coordinator. You're going to send it to them and say, okay, we've got a clear to close. I've got it in my revenue sheet. Here's the info on the property. Here's my 2-agent amount. Here's where we're closing. Here's the closing date and closing time. Okay, we're going to send all that info in so that our staff is prepared, can start checking the file, and can make sure that they have your money ready when you close the property so that you get paid in a timely manner. So when that clear to close happens, make sure you're sending all your info to the staff about this transaction. The other thing that's going to happen, so once we got a clear to close, there's this really, really important document called a closing disclosure. And this comes from the CFPB, which is an organization that was tasked with this specific document based off of the big market crash in 2008 when lending had a bunch of issues. So this new closing disclosure is a federally mandated item for any residential purchase with a loan. So it looks like this. It always looks like this. It's a federal form. This is just an example. It'll have a loan amount, an interest amount, monthly payment, and it's very specific in the way that it's laid out because it's supposed to be very obvious to buyers exactly what they're required to do in a loan. Now, we're not always privy to this information. We don't always get to see it, but the buyer has to see it and has to sign it. And in fact, there's a federal mandate on the deadline that this has to be signed by the buyers 3 days prior to closing. So this is a really good thing to ask your lender. Has the closing disclosure been sent out when we're getting a few days out from closing, or even talk to your buyer about it? Have you received the closing disclosure? You'll notice at the top it says closing disclosure. This is a federal form. It'll always look the exact same. So the buyer signs this, and this basically says they understand what the costs are associated with this mortgage. So this is your closing disclosure. Understand how it works. You won't always see it, but it's a good thing to ask the lender and the buyer if it's been sent/received and signed. The timing matters because that 3 days can push back your closing. If the closing disclosure gets held up, then it can push back the time in which your buyer can actually get the closing done in. So everyone needs to be aware of when the closing disclosure actually gets sent out and when it's actually signed. So once the closing disclosure is signed, there's one more step in the financing process, and this is the closing disclosure gets sent to the title company. The title company's job is to match their form that is the same as the closing disclosure, just in a different format, and it's called a settlement statement. You'll hear some old language sometimes used called a HUD-1. And this is a different form, but it's the exact same information. And it looks just like this. This is an example of one from a company in Arizona, but again, this is a national form, so it always has to look the same. Uh, this is a breakdown in a little easier to read format for our purposes of a buyer and seller side, all of their debits and credits in the transaction. And it ends in this really nice format that says due to buyer, due to seller. And it's either going to be an amount that they have to bring to closing or an amount they're netting at closing. So you can see if it's a credit, it's always going to be, you can see we got a buyer debit, which means this is the buyer side, which is a 1477.27, and then a due to seller, which is in their debit column. So these are both, this is a weird transaction where the buyer's actually getting paid money at closing. Usually it's going to say bring to closing for the buyer. So it's going to be the amount that they need to make their final checkout to. And we tell our buyer, okay, you're going to make your checkout for this amount. We've got it here, and you'll also have it in your closing disclosure, which will say cash to close on the closing disclosure. So the buyer knows exactly to the penny what their cashier's check needs to be that they bring to closing. These two forms have to match. So the process kind of works like this. You get a clear to close. The lender's going to send a closing disclosure to the buyer. The buyer's going to sign the closing disclosure. The lender is then going to send the closing disclosure to the title company. Title company is going to put their numbers in, and they're going to match it to the closing disclosure. Once they get it to match, you're going to hear the title person say that it is balanced. They use the term balanced, which means they match. And then they will say, we're good to go to closing. So this is kind of the last step in the financing process. What we as realtors need to check on our settlement statements are a couple of things. First off, we always want to check the sales price. It's possible through multiple addendums, the TRR period, something happened where the sales price changed. Maybe it got missed by someone. So we always need to make sure that that's actually correct on here. We want to make sure that our earnest money is correct. And then we want to just look through a few other pieces, including any credits or debits on the process. So maybe someone offered a home warranty like you see here. There's $500 that the seller is paying towards a home warranty. So these kind of credits and debits would be on here. A pest inspection's on here for $50. So we want to look at this and make sure all the credits and debits are correctly listed here. And of course, we want to look at the real estate commission here and make sure that the amount, which will always be debited to the seller, which is the seller paying their listing agreement commission amount. And it'll say real estate commission too. And one of these will say Weicker Realtor Centennial. You want to make sure that amount right there matches your gross commission listed in your revenue sheet. If that matches, then you know that you're getting paid the right amount, and you can let our staff know, hey, settlement statement matches, we should be good to go. This is kind of what we check on the settlement statement, but these are all the final steps of the financing process, which has taken us all the way from ordering the appraisal to underwriting, and then clear to close, closing disclosure, and settlement statement. The only thing that could catch us up in this point or in these steps is that appraisal coming in low. And again, we'd have to renegotiate, the buyer and seller would have to renegotiate to make the purchase price either match the appraisal amount, or the buyer would agree to bring the difference in cash to closing so that the loan stays at the rate that the appraisal would allow for, or any combination between of the purchase price getting lowered and the buyer bringing some cash to closing. This is the financing process. It causes all kinds of problems during a real estate transaction. It's one that we have the least control of during the real estate transaction. And that's the reason that we need to be as up to date and involved with it as possible so that we can make sure that it's staying on track while we're doing our job on all of our items on the other side. So these are the 4 big hurdles we've worked through in the inspection period, the TRR, and then repairs, and then the financing process. Next, we'll actually go through the closing process and get this thing to close so we can get our nice commission check at the end. See you in the next section.